Before we get into today's video, we want to bring you a word from our sponsor, Blinkist. I know that a lot of us would like to read more nonfiction books because who doesn't want to be more knowledgeable about the world? But sometimes we just don't have the time or the energy to slog through hundreds of pages of a book. This is why Blinkist is so amazing. Blinkist condenses some of the best nonfiction books so you can read them or listen to them like a podcast in just 15 minutes. When I signed up for Blinkist, I found out they had Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I had tried to read this book twice, but both times I stopped reading it because I just couldn't get into it. I knew that it was a fascinating book with some cool ideas, but it just wasn't for me. Using Blinkist, I listened to all the main points of the book in one evening while I washed the dishes. Blinkist also has some great true crime books that you can read or listen to in just 15 minutes. I highly recommend Raven by John Jacobs and Tim Ritterman, which is about Jim Jones and the People's Temple. The first 100 people to go to Blinkist.com/criminallylisted are going to get unlimited access for 1 week to try it out. You'll also get 25% off if you want a full membership. The membership is completely free for 7 days and you can cancel at any time. Help support Criminally Listed and increase your knowledge by checking out Blinkist.com/criminallylisted. Number 3. The Honolulu Strangler. In May 1985, Vicky Purdy was 25 years old and she lived in Honolulu, Hawaii. She had moved there about 16 months earlier with her husband of 5 years. She worked at a video rental store that rented pornographic movies. On the night of May 29, 1985, Purdy planned on meeting her friends at a club. However, she never made it there. When she didn't come home, she was reported missing by her husband. The next morning, Purdy's partially clad body was found on the banks of the Kihei Lagoon in Honolulu. Her wrists were bound behind her back and she had been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. Later that same day, her car was found in the parking garage of a hotel not far from the club. There was a new dent on the side of her car. After Purdy's body was found, a taxi driver got in contact with the police. The taxi driver said he had dropped Purdy off at the parking garage. At the time, the police thought that Purdy's murder was connected to a double homicide that happened at the video store where she worked about 5 months earlier. On December 16, 1985, 56-year-old Carol Drake, who was the co-owner of the store, and 39-year-old Terry Fox, who was the manager, were working at the video store. They were found stabbed to death. Drake had been stabbed once in the back. Fox's throat had been slashed and she had been stabbed in the neck. The cash receipts for the day were missing. An envelope with some money was found on the floor. It's thought that the double murder was a robbery gone wrong and the killer dropped the envelope as he was leaving. The murders have not been solved, but it's not believed that they are connected to the Honolulu Strangler case. 17-year-old Regina Sakamoto was described as shy but friendly. She lived with her mother and her brother in Honolulu. On January 15, 1986, about 6 months after Purdy was murdered, Regina left for school. Unfortunately, she missed her bus. She called her boyfriend and told him that she was going to be late for school. Later that day, Regina's dead, partially dressed body was found floating in the same lagoon where Purdy's body was found. Like Purdy, Regina's wrists had been bound behind her back. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. What was notable was that Regina's body was floating in the water, but her body had been tied to a rock on shore. This ensured that her body would not float out into the lagoon, and it made it more likely that her body would be found. It's suspected that Regina was kidnapped from the bus stop while she was waiting for the next bus to go to school. The police believe that the killer offered her a ride and she got into his vehicle. The police immediately thought that Purdy and Regina's murders were connected. They were both found in the same lagoon. Their wrists were bound behind their backs. They had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. 21-year-old Denise Hughes lived with her husband in Honolulu. Her husband was serving in the Navy and he was stationed on a boat docked in Pearl Harbor. Hughes worked for a telephone company. She usually took a city bus to and from work. On the morning of January 30th, 1986, 16 days after Regina's murder, Hughes did not arrive at work. 2 days later, her body was found in a stream about 2 miles from the lagoon. Like the first two victims, her wrists were bound behind her back. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. After Hughes's body was found, the Honolulu police and the FBI started a task force. But no immediate arrests were made. 2 months later, on March 26, 1986, 25-year-old Luis Medeiros was on the island of Kauai. Kauai is an island northwest of Oahu, which is the island where Honolulu is located. Medeiros lived in a small town close to Honolulu. Medeiros was on the island of Kauai because her mother had died and she was attending the reading of her mother's will. After the meeting, she told her family she was going to take the bus to the airport and then fly to Honolulu. On April 2, 1986, less than a week after Medeiros saw her family, her body was found in a gulch under an overpass just outside of the town where she lived. Her wrists had been bound, she had been raped and strangled. She was 3 months pregnant when she was murdered. The police suspected that the killer saw her waiting at a bus stop near the airport in Honolulu and he offered her a ride. 36-year-old Linda Pesce lived in Honolulu with her 7-year-old daughter and her roommate. She worked at a store that sold cellular phones. On April 29, 1986, she was promoted. That evening, when Pesce was done work, she set off in her car towards home. The drive should have only taken her 15 minutes. But she never made it home, and she was reported missing by her roommate. The next day, the police found her car abandoned on the side of the road. The police immediately suspected that she was a victim of the Honolulu Strangler. They thought she had car problems, and the killer picked her up. Several witnesses saw a van parked behind her car on the night she was driving home. They said that the van was American made and it was a late 1970s or early 1980s model. It was either white or cream color. There was possibly writing on the back window. The witnesses were also able to give a vague description of the man driving the van. He was described as a white man who was in his 30s or 40s. On May 3, 1986, 3 days after Pesce went missing, a 43-year-old man named Howard Andrew Gay called the Honolulu police. He told them he was in a field on Sand Island in Honolulu and he had found bones. Sand Island is not far from the lagoon where the first two bodies were found. It turned out that the bones he found were pig bones. While the police were in the field, there was a couple in the same field looking for cans. About 75 yards from the pig bones, the couple found the body of Linda Pesce. She was nude and her hands were bound behind her back. After Pesce's body was found, the police decided to investigate Howard Gay and they were able to connect him to Pesce. Just before Pesce was killed, she had canvassed the airport for potential customers. She had talked to Gay, and she wrote his name down on a notepad. Gay worked for a cargo company near the airport. Gay also drove a light-colored cargo van that had lettering in the back window. The police were also able to find connections between Gay and the other murdered women. Luis Medeiros' body was found in a different area than the other 4 bodies. Gay lived about 4 miles from where Medeiros' body was found. He would have passed by the area where her body was found when he was driving to and from work. Gay also matched the FBI's profile. The profiler thought that the strangler was a white man in his late 30s or 40s, and he probably didn't have a criminal record. Gay didn't have a criminal record, and he was 43 years old when the murder started. On May 9, 1986, Howard Gay was arrested. He took a polygraph exam, and the results were inconclusive. The police ended up releasing Gay 10 hours after he was arrested, and he was never charged in connection with the murders. After Gay was arrested, the murders suddenly came to an end. Months later, Gay moved away from Hawaii. Howard Gay died from kidney failure at the age of 60 in November 2003 in Inglewood, California. In 2018, the investigation Discovery show Breaking Homicide did an episode about the Honolulu Strangler. In the show, they revealed new details about the murders. Notably, all 5 victims have been bound with parachute cord. Also, all the victims either went missing from or their bodies were found near the airport. So the police thought that the killer was connected to the Daniel K. Inouye International Airport, which is Honolulu's main airport. Something else Breaking Homicide revealed is that based on the amount of sperm found inside the victims, it's believed that the killer had a vasectomy. Howard Gay's ex-wife revealed to the show that he had had a vasectomy. Something else that was made public was that Gay was married with 2 sons at the time of the murders. But his family was living in California. Gay had moved to Honolulu by himself when his work transferred him there. So he had a lot of time on his own. This is important because the FBI profiler thought that the killer stalked his victims. One thing that the investigators noted was that all the victims seemingly got into the killer's vehicle voluntarily. Had he forced them to get into his vehicle, there would have been signs of trauma on their body. So the police thought that the killer came across as extremely non-threatening. Another possibility is that the killer had previously met his victims, so their guard was down. Then, he offered them rides when they needed transportation. Since Gay was living alone in Honolulu, he would have had plenty of time to stalk his victims. One thing that the investigators found odd was that 5 women were killed in 11 months, and then the killings just stopped. It was speculated that the killer either moved away from the area or he was serving time in prison for another crime. In Breaking Homicide, the host of the show discovered another reason the killings may have stopped if Howard Gay was the strangler. A few months after the last victim was killed, Gay's son was killed when he was struck by a car while changing a tire on the side of the road. After the death of his son, Gay became a born-again Christian. The host speculated that the death of his son, his newfound religious beliefs, and the pressure of him being a suspect forced Gay to stop killing. The investigators in Honolulu believe that Howard Gay was most likely the Honolulu Strangler. A deputy prosecutor who worked on the case said that with today's forensic technology, if Gay was still alive, they would probably charge him with the murders. But officially, the case of the Honolulu Strangler is considered unresolved. Number 2. Charlie Chopoff. March 9th, 1972 was a rainy day in New York City. 8-year-old Douglas Owens was sent out to run some errands in East Harlem. Sadly, he never returned home. Later that day, his body was found on the roof of a walk-up tenement about 2 blocks from his home. He had been stabbed 38 times in the chest, neck, and back. He had also been sexually mutilated, but his penis remained attached to his body. 6 weeks later, on April 20th, 1972, an unidentified 10-year-old boy was running errands in Manhattan. He was lured to the roof of a tenement by a man who said his name was Michael. On the roof, the man attacked the boy with a knife, stabbing him several times. This time, the killer cut off the boy's penis and took it with him. Amazingly, the boy survived the attack. He was able to give a description of the man who attacked him. He said that his attacker was white or possibly Hispanic. He had dark hair and he was thin. The boy thought that the man was in his late 30s. He had a mole on his left cheek, and he also had black marks on the left side of his chin. People who lived in the area immediately noticed similarities between the two attacks. Both victims were black, they were close in age, they were attacked on the roof of a tenement, and they were sexually mutilated. The boys were also attacked within 2 miles of each other. 6 months later, on October 23, 1972, 9-year-old Wendell Hubbard was playing outside. When he didn't come home for dinner, his mother became worried. Hours later, his body was found on the roof of a building. He had been stabbed 17 times and his genitals were missing. People immediately thought that this murder was connected to the 2 other attacks. Like the first 2 victims, Wendell was black and he was stabbed and sexually mutilated on a rooftop. Wendell was killed about half a mile away from where Douglas Owens was murdered. 5 months went by and there were no attacks, but unfortunately, no arrests were made either. On March 7, 1974, 9-year-old Luis Ortez went to a store around the corner from his home to buy milk and bread. When he didn't come home, he was reported missing. The next day, his body was found at the bottom of a stairwell of a tenement a few blocks from his home. He had been stabbed 38 times and his genitals were missing. Although Luis was Puerto Rican and not African American, and he was killed in a basement and not on a rooftop, people knew that he was killed by the same man who had attacked the 3 other boys. Luis's body was found just a block away from where the second boy was attacked. At this point, the residents of the area where the boys were killed were afraid and angry. It led to about 300 people protesting around the police station. In response, the police department assigned 50 detectives to the case, and there was an additional 10-person task force which aided in the investigation. They did door-to-door searches, and they interviewed over 150 persons of interest. They also reviewed over 9,000 police records regarding child molesters. They even asked Interpol to look at their records for a possible suspect. The police released a sketch of the killer that was based on the description from the boy who survived the attack. The police interviewed people who were in Luis's neighborhood when he was killed. Several of them saw a suspicious man, and based on their descriptions, this photo montage was made and released to the public. The witnesses said that the man was between 5'5" and 5'10", with a slim build. He had olive skin, his face had pockmarks, and he may have had a mole on his left cheek. One notable physical attribute is that he walked with a limp. Unfortunately, none of this led to an arrest. On the night of August 17th, 1973, 8-year-old Stephen Cropper went outside to play. It had been over 5 months since the last murder. About an hour after Stephen went outside, his dead body was found on the rooftop of a tenement. His murder was different from the other attacks. Stephen had not been stabbed. Instead, he had been slashed with a razor. He died after an artery in his elbow was cut. After he was dead, a large X was cut into his chest. And finally, Stephen was not sexually mutilated. At first, the police were unsure if Stephen's murder was connected to the other attacks. Besides details of the murder being different from the other 4 attacks, Stephen lived and was killed in a different area of the city. The other murders happened in Manhattan and East Harlem. Stephen lived and died in the Lower East Side. While there were noticeable differences, the police did see several similarities. The first is that Stephen fit the killer's victim profile. He was black and 8 years old. He was also murdered on the rooftop of a tenement not far from his home. Several people saw a man running away from the building where Stephen was killed, and this composite image was developed. The police noted that the description of Stephen's killer matched the description of the attacker in the other cases. So the police decided that one man was most likely responsible for all 5 attacks. 3 days after Stephen's murder, the police arrested a man who they thought looked like the composite image of the killer. The man had been caught sexually abusing a 5-year-old Puerto Rican boy in a park in the Bronx. But it turned out that the man was not in the city when the murders were committed, so he was cleared as a suspect. Then on March 25, 1974, 9 months after Stephen's murder, a 33-year-old man named Erno Soto was arrested. Soto had been caught trying to kidnap a young Puerto Rican boy. The boy ran away screaming, and people who were in the area detained Soto. Soto had a criminal record. In total, he has spent about 11 years in prison on burglary and narcotics convictions. He had also spent a considerable amount of time in a psychiatric hospital. Soto had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. A doctor said he would become violent with grandiose religious delusions. After Soto was arrested for attempting to kidnap the boy, he was sent to Bellevue Hospital. The police noted that Soto looked like the sketches of the killer. Detectives went to the hospital to interview him about the 4 murders and the attempted murder. He quickly confessed to killing Stephen Cropper, but he denied committing the other murders. The boy who survived his attack viewed Soto in a lineup. He did not identify him as the man who attacked him, but he did say that Soto looked like his attacker. In July 1974, the police ended up clearing Soto as a suspect in the other 3 murders. Erno Soto went to trial for the murder of Stephen Cropper in the winter of 1976. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was sent to a maximum security psychiatric hospital. One of the doctors who testified at Soto's trial said that Soto would probably never be released. He said that Soto is in need of constant surveillance. When he is out in society on his own, he is literally a walking time bomb. So, did Erno Soto attack the other 4 boys? In Soto's court records for the murder of Stephen Cropper, it lists the dates he was in a psychiatric hospital. The hospital was only a few miles away from where the 4 attacks took place. Soto was first admitted to the hospital 3 days after Douglas Owens was killed, which was the first murder. Soto was not in the hospital on April 20th, 1985, when the boy was attacked but survived. It's unclear if he was released from the hospital or if he escaped. Regardless, he returned to the hospital 3 days after the attack on April 23rd. He was released shortly afterward as an outpatient, but the hospital lost contact with him for a year. During that year, Wendell Hubbard and Louise Ortiz were killed. Soto was again hospitalized in April 1973, about a month after Louise was murdered. He was released on the morning of Friday, August 17, 1973. That afternoon, Stephen Cropper was killed. He had been released on a weekend pass and he returned to the hospital on August 19th. That means Soto was free when all the murders were committed. Also, Soto supposedly had friends and family who lived in the area where the first 4 boys were killed. He apparently visited those friends and family often, and he was familiar with the area. People also point out that after Soto was hospitalized after the murder of Stephen Cropper, the killings suddenly stopped. Many people believe that Erno Soto is the serial killer known as Charlie Chop-Off. Due to privacy laws, it's unknown if Soto is still hospitalized or if he is even still alive. The newspaper accounts gave conflicting ages of Soto. By the time of this video, if he is still alive, he is around the age of 80. Besides the murder of Stephen Cropper, the cases are considered officially unsolved. Number 1. The Frankfurt Slasher. The village of Frankfurt, Pennsylvania was founded in 1682. In 1854, it was annexed by the city of Philadelphia. Today, Frankfurt is a neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia. In the mid-1970s, some of the scenes in the movie Rocky were filmed in Frankfurt. By the 1980s, the neighborhood was run down. The area became known for prostitution and drug use. On August 26, 1985, the body of 52-year-old Helen Patton was found in the maintenance yard of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, also known by the acronym SEPTA. The yard was at the end of the Frankfurt line. Patton had been sexually assaulted and then stabbed or slashed 47 times in the chest and the head. Patton lived with her ex-husband in a town just outside of Philadelphia. He last saw her the night before she was killed. Patton was known to frequent bars in Frankfurt. One bar where she was a regular was the Golden Bar in Frankfurt. The Golden Bar, which was known as Goldie to locals, was on Frankfurt Avenue. It was just a few hundred yards from the maintenance yard where Patton's body was found. It was a popular hangout for SEPTA workers. No arrests were made in the wake of Patton's murder. 68-year-old Anna Carroll lived in an apartment on the second floor of a building in South Philadelphia. On January 3, 1986, a neighbor asked the building manager to check on her. He found Carroll dead on her bedroom floor. She had been stabbed 6 times and there was a gaping hole in her abdomen. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, was still lodged in her body. She had been sexually assaulted before she was stabbed to death. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Not much is known about Carroll. What is known is that she liked to frequent bars, especially the Golden Bar. Nearly a year went by and there were no murders. On Christmas Day 1986, a neighbor of 74-year-old Susan Olslaff noticed her door was ajar. He went inside her apartment to check on her and he found her stabbed to death. She had been stabbed 6 times in the back after she was sexually assaulted. Oslaf was a regular at the Golden Bar. 28-year-old Jean Durkin struggled with mental illness and she lived on the streets. She usually slept on the step of an abandoned bakery that was just a few doors down from the Golden Bar. She was known to go into the Golden Bar when she had a few dollars to spend. On January 8, 1987, 2 weeks after Oslaf's murder, Durkin was found murdered. Her partially dressed body was found under a truck behind a fruit and vegetable stand a little more than half a mile from where Helen Patton's body was found. Durkin had been sexually assaulted, beaten in the face, and stabbed 74 times. On January 29, 1987, another patron of the Golden Bar was found murdered. 29-year-old Catherine Jones's frozen body was found beside a sidewalk in the Northern Liberties neighborhood. Unlike the other victims, Jones had not been stabbed. Instead, her cause of death was strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. Since she was strangled and beaten and not stabbed, the police were hesitant to say that her murder was connected to the other four. In August 1987, the Philadelphia Police Department set up a task force to find the killer, but no arrests were made. Over 14 months later, on November 10, 1988, 66-year-old Margaret Vaughn was evicted from her apartment, but she did not move out right away. At about 1 a.m. on November 11th, 2 residents in her building noticed that her door was ajar. They opened it, and in the foyer of the apartment was Vaughn's dead body. She had been stabbed 27 times in the torso, neck, and head. Vaughn had not been sexually assaulted. Once again, there were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. It does not appear that robbery was the motive, because Vaughn had $200 on her. Vaughn had been a regular at the Golden Bar, but she had not been there recently. Earlier on the night Vaughn died, she was at a bar. A bartender saw her talking to a man who she described as white. He wore glasses, he had a round head, and he had a limp. The description of the man did not lead to an arrest. 30-year-old Teresa Shortino was not a regular at the Golden Bar, but she did frequent other bars on Frankfort Avenue. On the afternoon of January 19, 1989, she was drinking at the Jelly Post Tavern. She left the bar by herself at about 6:30. A few hours later, she was found dead in her apartment. Her apartment was just 3 blocks from the previous victim's apartment. She had been stabbed in the face, neck, and arms 25 times. A 3.5-foot piece of wood was found in her apartment. It is believed that she was sexually assaulted with the piece of wood. The police interviewed patrons and bartenders in bars along Frankfort Avenue. One bartender remembered seeing Shortino talking to a man a day or 2 before she was killed. He was white, he had a round head, he wore glasses, and he walked with a limp. For 15 months, there were no murders, and no progress was made on the case. On April 29, 1990, 46-year-old Carol Dowd was found dead in an alley behind a fish market on Frankfort Avenue. She had been stabbed 36 times. Her left nipple had nearly been severed, and her stomach had been cut open. There were a lot of similarities between Dowd's murder and the other 7 murders. Earlier on the night Dowd was killed, she was at a bar. Like several of the other victims, Dowd had a history of mental illness. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. A witness contacted the police and told them that they saw Dowd on the night she died, not far from the alley. The witness said that Dowd was talking to a white man. The police soon had a suspect in Dowd's murder, and he did not match the description of the man seen with any of the victims. The suspect was a 38-year-old man named Leonard Christopher. Christopher worked at the fish market where Dowd's body was found. Christopher had worked his entire adult life and he did not have a criminal record. He was questioned by the police and he mentioned that he knew Margaret Vaughn, who was the fifth victim. The police asked Christopher what he was doing on the night Dowd was murdered. He said he spent the night with his girlfriend, but his girlfriend did not corroborate his alibi. Then the police found a witness who said she saw Christopher at the same bar where Dowd had been drinking. Then the police talked to a prostitute who was addicted to drugs. She had previously told the police that she did not see Dowd on the night she was killed. But when she was re-interviewed, she changed her story and she said she saw her talking to Christopher. The police searched Leonard Christopher's apartment and they found some bloody clothes. He explained that his clothes got bloody when he cleaned up the blood from Dowd's murder. Christopher's boss said that he was acting nervous after the murder. Christopher's boss also said that Christopher said, "Maybe I killed her." Then he immediately said, "No, I didn't." On May 5, 1990, Leonard Christopher was arrested and charged with the murder of Carol Dowd. He was held without bail while he awaited his trial. The people of Philadelphia were breathing a little bit easier because they thought that the killer, who the media had dubbed the Frankfurt Slasher, had been arrested. Then, on September 6, 1990, a woman was found murdered in her apartment. She was 30-year-old Michelle Denner. There were no signs of forced entry or a break-in. Denner lived 3 blocks from Teresa Shortino, who had been killed 9 months earlier. Like the other victims, Denner lived on the edges of society. She had mental health problems and she drank heavily. Denner had been stabbed 23 times. Before Denner was found dead, she was seen talking to a white man who resembled the sketches of the Frankfurt Slasher. It was clear to many people that one person was responsible for all 9 murders because of the similarities in the cases. All the victims were white women who were barflies. At least 5 were regulars at the Golden Bar, and another victim was a former regular. Golden Bar was on Frankfurt Avenue, and the other women frequented bars on the same street. Many of the victims had a history of mental illness. All the victims, except for one, were stabbed multiple times. In several cases, they were stabbed dozens of times. 5 of the 9 victims were killed in their apartments. Their apartments showed no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Except for 3 victims, all of them were killed in the Frankfurt neighborhood. 3 of the victims were seen with a white, middle-aged man with glasses and a round head shortly before they were killed. If one person killed all 9 women, it couldn't have been Leonard Christopher. He was in jail awaiting his trial when the 9th victim, Michelle Denner, was killed. Nevertheless, Leonard Christopher went to trial for the murder of Carol Dowd in December 1990. The prosecution's case was made up entirely of circumstantial evidence. The trial lasted for 6 days. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. On December 12, 1990, Leonard Christopher was found guilty of first-degree murder. As Christopher was being led out of the courtroom, he shouted that the serial killer was still free and he was being railroaded. The jury was given the choice of sentencing Christopher to life in prison without parole or sentencing him to death. They deliberated his fate for an hour and a half. They chose to sentence him to life without parole. Christopher's defense lawyer thought that they chose life without parole because they realized they had made a mistake in convicting him. After the murder of Michelle Denner, the Frankfurt slasher murder suddenly came to an end. No one was sure why, but was suspected that he died, moved away from the area, or he was imprisoned for an unrelated crime. Or it's possible that he realized that after Leonard Christopher was convicted, that he got away with the murders. Leonard Christopher died from cancer behind bars in 2015. He always maintained he was innocent. Today, it's widely believed he was wrongly convicted and the Frankfurt slasher got away with murdering 9 women. In the ensuing years, the police developed a theory about the killer, and they even had a suspect. The police thought that the killer posed as a counselor. He may have even rented an office in a church. Over time, he talked to the victims, and they trusted him. Then, when he had them alone, he brutally murdered them. The police developed a prime suspect. He moved away from Philadelphia after the murder of Michelle Denner. The suspect died in 2008. The police have never publicly identified the suspect. The case of the Frankfurt slasher is considered officially unresolved. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, if you are looking for something new to watch, why not check out my new channel, Chapter Dark. The videos are mysteries that you can try and solve. Do you have what it takes to solve these mysteries? You can find a link to Chapter Dark in the description box below. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.